Hi everyone, it's Margie DiPaolo, and this is the Choices with Margie podcast, where we discuss how our choices shape our lives. Do these choices affect our lives in a positive way or maybe not such a great way? How are challenges, our successes? Do we pivot? Do we stay the course? Anyways, how do we have our best lives? So today our guest is Anna Boulay, who is the district sales manager for the Chico's FAS organization. So Anna and I one day were having a discussion and I was like, you need to tell your life story. And she was like, I would love to share my life story because it's a journey. Welcome, Anna.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you.
Oh, you're sure you are. Anna has a story of how her choice led her on a successful journey, and but you had some challenges, huh?
Many challenges. Journey, I think, is a light word to use for the last 43 years of my life.
So, tell your story of your childhood. What was that?
So, I was a child of a drug addict and a Vietnam vet alcoholic. And combined together was kind of a disaster. But the two of them didn't start that way. And I think it's important to talk about like their journey first because that directly affects my journey.
Mm-hmm.
My mother was an attorney. She graduated from law school at the top of her class. She was the daughter of an Army general, and her mother worked for the Secret Service, and they liberated concentration camps. And so that was her upbringing. Very militant family. And she was probably one of the smartest women that I had ever met in my life. And my father was a soldier, and they met and almost immediately had my brother Joe. And I think if you look at the pictures, you can see that she may have been pregnant at the wedding, unconfirmed. And then 3 years later, I came along in their lives, and I think the first couple of years were, almost serendipitous. They were settled, and she graduated from college and took a career, and things kind of spiraled from there for them.
Was this in like the Western New York area?
No, I grew up in Maine.
In Maine, okay.
And my mother was sitting at her desk one day, and a client walked in, and he was, his biker name was Butch, and right, Butch, and asked her to take his case and for a criminal case, and that was kind of the beginning of the end for her. She made a choice to take him on as a client, and what he did was show her another side of life that she had never experienced before.
So how old were you at this time?
I think I was 3. I think I was 3 years old. Shortly after that, my parents divorced, and my father found the end of a bar stool, and that's where he remained, I think, for most of his life. And my mother went down this road. She married a Hell's Angel, and it was the early 80s, and, crack was kind of hitting the market hot and heavy as this escape route, and it was a whole different lifestyle that she immersed herself in.
So did she keep working as an attorney?
She did not.
No,
that was kind of the end of it. I think it's frowned upon to date your criminal clients.
Oh, okay.
Even in 1985, I think that wasn't.
Was your father working though while this was?
He was a pipe fitter, but shortly after that, he kind of spiraled, and jobs were, less and less, and I didn't really have a ton of contact with him after that point.
And he stayed in Maine?
He stayed in Maine. And, my earliest memories were, we spent a lot of time in a bar. He was.
You spent time in the bar?
Yeah, I remember being, 4 or 5 years old, and I would play house with the pool cues on the pool table. In this, like, he belonged to some social club.
Yeah.
And I would eat pickled eggs out of the jar, and
Wow.
he used to tell me, like, Annie, go get, here's $5, go get $5 and scratch off tickets. And we used to say put $5 in the jar because all of the scratch off tickets came out of this big, giant pickle jar. And that was my entertainment. I would play house with pool balls and shuffleboard. And
now, was your brother with you at this time?
I don't recall. My brother spent the majority of his time with my mother. He had some attachment issues to her. And throughout the course of our, teenage years and into early adulthood before she passed, he always stayed with her. So there were numerous amount of times throughout our childhood where the two of us were separated.
So you were with your mom throughout your childhood then?
I wasn't. When I was 7 was the first time I went into foster care.
Now, how did that happen?
We were in this
pool hall.
We weren't in the pool hall. Ironically enough, that would have been a safer place. But, my mother was engrossed into this biker world. And in the biker world, they have what they call a clubhouse. And that's where, they spend a lot of their time and where the parties happen. And that's where they congregate. There was a discharged weapon one evening, and a gentleman was hit, and there was an altercation of some sort that happened, and I was located behind a TV stand, by the authorities, and that was the first time that I went into foster care. I think I was 7.
And what was that like?
There's a lot of different perceptions from children if they grow up in the system and what they come out of it. And a lot of it is the child's perception. I grew up in chaos my entire life. And to this point, I was 7, I think I was in the 2nd grade. I hadn't been to the same school for longer than, 6 months, 5 months. It was this constant change.
So you weren't making like lifelong friends and going to birthday parties and things like that?
No, we didn't have birthdays. That was that was secondary to life. We didn't have Christmas presents or, dinner. Like, those weren't things that were a normal occurrence for me, and I was a small child. So for me, I went into a house with strangers who were like, here's a bed to sleep in. It's quiet. And there's no chaos. So as crazy as it might sound, like, that was a peaceful experience almost to do that.
So how long were you in that first foster care home?
I don't think it was super long. The foster care system in the 80s was very different than it is now. I think all you have to do is show up to court and you can get your kids back. So it was, this bounced system, in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out, in and out.
And again, this was still in Maine then?
This was still in Maine. A year later, I have, my mother had a plethora of siblings. There were 5 in her family, and she was in the middle. And she had a younger sister, who I'm still very close with to this day. She's the person who I consider, to be my quote-unquote family.
And where does she live?
She lives in Maine.
Okay.
And she was, I think, 8 years younger than my mother. And so the school called her one day and said, we haven't seen the Boulay children in weeks. We've been unable to get a hold of a parent. Is there, can you, do you know where they are? Do they transfer school? Like, we can't see a transfer for them. The Boulay children have just disappeared. And so she went on a mission with the oldest sister to try to locate us. And they did find us in a crack house I guess, from what I have very little memory of this, but from what my aunt said, she was looking through the window, and she was bar hopping. Like, have you seen this woman that I'm looking for a woman who looks just like me. Do you know where she is? And somebody sent her upstairs to this, vacant apartment. And she said she could see that my brother and I were sitting on the floor with a newspaper, and there was nothing in the room. Except for over on the side, she could see a mattress on the floor, and my mother apparently was having relations with some man on the floor while Joseph and I were 15 feet away reading a newspaper. So they,
Oh my gosh. We're like, what's happening in politics today?
Right.
Joseph?
Right.
What the hell?
Right.
Oh
I'm like, Joe, anything good in the sports
I
section?
know, really. You done with the comics?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yikes. I'm not making fun of it at all. It's just
that was the reality.
The reality of it.
That was the reality. And it's okay because I find humor in all of this now.
You have to.
Now, even when I tell the story, Margie, I sit here and I think about like how ludicrous it sounds as an adult with like a functional life to think back about. I mean, it's really crazy.
Yeah.
It's really crazy.
So, I know this is going to be a weird question. Yeah, whatever. But where's Butch in all this?
Oh, no, he's long gone at this point.
He's long gone, okay.
Oh, yeah.
So she's doing this to get money for drugs, probably.
Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty sure that that was a trick she was turning at this point to get a fix.
Mm-hmm.
There was, there's just a cycle of men in and out. And
none of them are bothered with you then.
No.
You're lucky.
One thing I can say about bikers, like I could accurately cut a kilo of cocaine at 7 years old.
Yeah.
I mean, I thought I was baking, like it was 1 cup of this and a half a cup of this, and you'd stir it around and you'd put it in a little baggie and you'd put it on the scale, and that was my entertainment. I didn't know any different. I was a 7-year-old child. But they would shoot somebody in the face to protect me. Because there's a code about children within that world, and you don't cross it. So, from that aspect, I was always incredibly protected. And I've always told my kids, like, if you're ever lost, you find a big burly guy on a Harley Davidson with some faded out patches on a leather vest, and you go to him, because that man's not going to let anything happen to you. Physically, that's never, that's a non-issue. They do what they do in their own times to make their money and have their fun. But when it comes to children, they're driving 100 miles with, toys and stuffed animals strapped all over their bikes. So it's very different. So from that point, the 2 aunts bust in the door. Physically, my mother's youngest sister is a scrappy girl. Her parents died when she was 17 and she was on her own, and much like me, kind of just had to find her own way. So there was a physical altercation that happened, and for the first time, those 2 took us out of the home together, and we went to go live with my oldest aunt, and so that was my, I think, 11th school in the 3rd grade.
Wow.
When we went there. And, that experience, most people think, oh, good, finally somebody stepped up. That was actually probably one of the most traumatizing experiences through my childhood, and pretty much a defining moment for me. And I was 10, not 10, I was 8, 3rd grade. Something in my head at that point kind of switched.
You think it's because you started to get older and started to realize what was going on, or
no? It was they lived a Pollyanna life.
The 2 sisters.
No, the one sister I went to go live with, and she had a husband and 3 kids,
Oh, okay.
and they both had good jobs, and they lived in this big house, and They were incredibly Christian and their kids played sports. And it was this whole environment that I had never been in my life. When you go into a foster care situation, your job is really to be invisible. They will provide for you. You have food and you have, but you don't know them.
Shelter.
Right. You have a bed, you have shelter, but you don't know them and you have no expectation. You show up with a black garbage bag with whatever small possessions you have, knowing that you're going to leave there. You don't have a connection to them.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, as an 8-year-old child, these were people I had known my entire life.
Mm-hmm.
I had a cousin who was 6 weeks older than me, also a female. And for me, I thought this was going to be an opportunity for me to have, some kind of normal life. And even if it was just for a small glimpse of time, she had toys, I didn't have toys, I played with pool cues. And
so did you feel going into this, did you feel less than?
Not until I got into the situation. So, there was some excitement, but we have to I can't stress enough that there was nothing constant in my life up to this point ever. It was all chaos. So at this point I had, my coping mechanism was just to go with the flow.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever, just whatever will happen will happen. And when I got there, the expectation that I had of familiar people and some kind of normal life really didn't happen, because it was the first time that I was ever told on a continuously basis every single day that I was not wanted there.
What?
And I wasn't.
Did they verbally say that?
Yes.
To you? This is your aunt saying this?
Yes.
To you?
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was but with side comments.
Were you behaving?
Yes, I was an incredible child, but my brother was not.
Okay.
So she took both of us in. He did not stay for very long. He was very angry. If I was 8, he was 11 at this point. And he was like a violent tantrum child.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't know how.
Was he always that way, or did it evolve after?
Ever since my parents got divorced.
Yeah.
From what I understand, he spent the first year just crying every single day. He was incredibly sensitive and didn't understand what happened. And all of a sudden, his father was just disappeared, and his mother was behaving erratically. And he was incredibly sensitive. Mm-hmm. And, so sensitive that it affected him 10 times more than it affected me. I found literature and, I was the quiet mouse in the corner and all I did was read books. And I was, 8 years old reading 400-page V.C. Andrew books over and over and over again. And that's just how I kept the chaos, out of my everyday life. And Joe didn't have an outlet like that.
So how long did you stay with them?
I was with them for about 6 months. And Joe was there, I think, less than 6 weeks.
And then where did you go?
So then we went to my biological father, took us for 1 year. And we lived with him when I was in the 4th grade.
Another school?
Another school. I didn't go to the same school for longer than 1 year ever, my entire life.
Even high school?
Even high school.
Wow.
I did. There were 2 years in high school that were, back-to-back years. And so we lived with him for 1 year. And, we didn't really see him much. He was trying to work. I think there was some, perhaps there was some welfare involved, but we lived 2 blocks away from this bar that he was at. So that entire year was really just immersed into, the bar. And that's where we were, every single day. And then we came home one day from school and he was gone. And we stayed in that apartment, I think, for a couple weeks until a truant officer came and knocked on the door because Joe was older, so he would have been in middle school then.
So how did you have money to get food and things like that?
I mean, we would eat at school.
Oh.
And that was kind of...
So you fully understand when budgets change for, subsidies for school lunches and things like that.
Yeah.
How it affects you.
Yeah. I mean, it really affects those kids. But there were a number of years where, that was all the substance that we got all day. And when we got to high school, we'll talk about that later, but, there was a lunch lady who used to sneak the extra chicken sandwich, eat this later.
What was her name?
Her name was Sally Maris.
See, and you remember her name.
I 100% remember her name.
Okay.
And then from there we went...
I got my Kleenex ready.
I know.
Oh.
And then from there we went to a public housing development in, I guess, a high crime.
This was with your mom?
Yeah, we went into it. I distinctly remember this, cinder block wall apartment that we lived in, excuse me, in the inner city, and just drugs and crime. And, Joseph and I were definitely the minorities in the neighborhood.
So Joe never got involved in any of the drugs and stuff in there because he was...
I mean, we were so young.
Yeah.
I would have been 10 at this point. Joe was 13. So we're starting to get to a point where Joe is, dabbling a little bit. But this was like a weird year for us. I was 10, Joe was 13. We lived in this, cinder block, box apartment. And it was really just Joe and I. My mother was just kind of gone at this point. And this is, I start to have some like very clear memories at this point. Everything before that's a little fuzzy except for like, factual things.
So how do you get clothes and food and things like that?
We just don't. My brother used to stay home as we got close to food stamp day. And he would stay home from school so he could get them from the mailbox before
someone would steal them.
Before she would come home because she would trade them for drugs.
Oh wow.
And so we would, do things like, he would go to the corner store and, I remember him having, ramen noodles and boxes of macaroni and cheese and like cans of like beefaroni, and we would hide them under the beds. So there would be something. But during this point, Joe's starting to get increasingly angry because now he's like starting to go through puberty and, he's changing and, so he started to get a little bit more, violent and I think more just like confused because we were alone. I mean, it would be weeks at a time that she would be gone and it would just be the two of us in this apartment together. And, one day she brought home this man, and his name was Rainey, and he was a big time crack dealer down on, the strip. And my mother, I think, was trying to work odd jobs. She was trying to, bartend and, I don't know what she did. I know that she did work out of a brothel because I went there a couple times after school and they would sit me there with a coloring book and people would come in and out. And it was no better than like what you would think of like a stash house or a crack house. But they were just turning tricks. And I would just sit there, read my book or color, do whatever. And try to get through schoolwork. School for me at that point in time was like the safe haven. And I'm sure that I was, the dirty kid, the smelly kid, I mean, probably not the smelly kid because I did try to take care of myself at a young age. But I definitely, everything was, hand me down. And, I remember a teacher, my fifth grade teacher, his name was Mr. Campbell, brought me in shoes one year and a winter jacket and a hat. We lived in central Maine. The winter it's cold. And so he, him and his wife tried to take care of me a lot. He would bring me a packed lunch every day. But I was only in that school for 1 year. So Rainey came into the life, and he really tried to get her to clean up her act. And he's still in my life today. So he did have an impact for, what it was worth at that time. And he was career in and out of jail, also an alcoholic, had some drug charges, I think stole a piece of equipment. But he, and I know this is going to sound crazy, but he was a decent role model in comparison to the rest of the people who had took a step into my life. And I remember him sitting me down at one point, and I must have been 11 or 12. And I remember him telling me, it was a critical moment in my life where he said, Annie, if you don't work hard in your life, you're nothing but a piece of shit. And that was his words of wisdom, and that's what he was willing to give me. And I remember thinking, like, okay, you work hard, otherwise you're a piece of shit. And what I've been surrounded with at that point in my life was a whole bucket of a piece of shit.
Mm-hmm.
And, that was, and, we talked about this before, but it was everywhere we went, there was a stigma of, that's Shelley's daughter. Look at them. And you think about yourself as, a fairly, middle class to affluent person now, and you had careers, and, you work at it, and, you walk down the street and you see the dirty people sitting on the side of the street, they're begging for stuff. And even if you give them $5, you're still judging in your head. Right? Like, that's human nature to do that. And it was that judgment that, was cast upon me from the day I was born. It was, and, so we can go into that later, but, so he told me this, if you don't work hard your entire life, you're nothing but a piece of shit.
So I think this is a good time to just stop and take a pause, because we're going to go into part 2, because I want to make sure we have time to get into how you and Joe's lives kind of took different paths. Yeah. I think that's important, because those are the choices that you made. And it might have been that little work hard, or, from Rainey, that comment. So we're going to take a pause for ending of part 1, and then we'll come back for part 2 with Anna Boulay.